Good evening. I wonder how much time you spend thinking about God. It seems everyone in the world has a view. For some, God is personal. Believing is a vital part of their individual identity. For others, God is political. Faith makes them part of something much bigger. In fact, God is a subject that every generation in every culture has thought about, argued over, and fought for. We have 90 minutes tonight, and we are going to use it to try to work out how we feel about God, what our beliefs make us think and do. We can't promise any neat conclusions, but we'll be hearing views from followers of different faiths and from people who don't believe in God, both here in London and from our international studios. And we'll be bringing you the results of a specially commissioned global opinion poll about God and us. 10,000 people in 10 different countries have been asked about their beliefs and their attitudes to religion, and we'll be comparing their answers. We've also had cameras around the world to get the thoughts of a wide range of people. Before we meet our guests, let's just hear some personal views about the meaning of God.
God is everything. Absolutely everything. Every particle, every feeling.
God is the mind and the heart of the whole earth.
Is the mastermind.
God is the creator and the ruler of this universe and my life.
Who's omniscient and omnipresent.
It's us. We are God.
I think he's probably a jazz buff.
For us, God is truth, consciousness and bliss.
He's the one who causes us to live, causes us to die, and who will bring us back to life again.
God is one, and he's eternal.
He is capable of filling our hearts and changing our lives.
God also has different names.
Rama,
Mudimo,
Hashem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu,
the Lord Jesus Christ,
Radha Krishna.
God is some kind of ideological creation.
God doesn't exist.
God historically has been an explanation for things we didn't understand.
God is important to everybody, I think, in their own personal way.
Who or what is God? That's the big philosophical question, and if anybody had the answer to that, frankly, there'd be peace all over the world.
Well, I suspect we'll get just as broad a range of views from our guests tonight. Here with me in the studio, the Poet Laureate Andrew Motion, the Bishop of Liverpool, the Right Reverend James Jones, Sister Wendy Beckett, who's a Carmelite nun and art historian, neuroscientist Susan Greenfield, the comedian Sean Hughes, and Imran Khan, former cricketer and in Pakistan, a politician. So just tell us, first of all, if you can, what you all believe. Andrew Motion.
Well, I was brought up in a church-going Anglican family, and I went to Anglican schools, the second of which was in fact rather developed in its interest in religion. It was originally an Oxford Movement foundation. And during my time there I got rather interested in Catholicism, which seemed the next natural, logical step. Since then, my faith has ebbed and flowed. And at the moment I happen to be in an ebb situation rather than a flow situation.
Jim Jones, are you in an ebb or a flow at the moment? You've got to be flowing, haven't you?
Faith is always growing, and for me, faith inspires a care for God's earth, a seeking of justice for the poor in the world, and discovering a purpose for our existence, which is supremely to know that there is a God who loves us and one who forgives us, and he's done that especially through his son Jesus.
Sister Wendy, do you feel you have knowledge as opposed to faith?
I would not make a distinction between faith and knowledge. But since I think God transcends all words and concepts, I find it almost impossible to speak about God. But with that proviso, I'd say to me, God is absolute reality, and all other realities are relative to that.
Susan Greenfield?
I would say reality for me is the human mind, and I can't really buy into an entity outside of the human mind that nonetheless would have a mind itself. On the other hand, I don't want to be a typical stereotype scientist who doesn't believe in anything, not even spirituality. I think the human mind in relation to spirituality is a very important notion.
Sean Hughes, you were brought up as a Catholic, weren't you?
Yeah, but it wasn't really been brought up as one. The whole religion was forced upon me. I had absolutely no choice. I was baptised, without given any choice in the situation. Even was an altar boy, and then even thought about becoming a priest, and then I stopped believing totally in God.
Imran Khan, your beliefs?
very strong belief in God, and you know, the first person who spoke on that video was that everything is God.
Right, well, thank you very much indeed. In our international studios, we have in New York, Jonathan Miller, broadcaster and opera director. Jonathan is an avowed atheist. Also, there is Dr. Richard Land, who's a Southern Baptist, one of President Bush's religious advisors. From North Carolina, we have Ariel Dorfman, the Chilean playwright. He's agnostic. In South Africa, Johannesburg, we're joined by the eminent Nigerian Cardinal Francis Arunze, a strong contender to be the next Pope, we're told. With him is the South African musician Tunokwe, who was brought up as a Methodist, and others too. We'll be meeting them in a moment, but first, let's look in more detail at our unique global survey carried out for the BBC by the independent pollsters ICM. 10,000 people across the world were questioned in December and January. These are the countries: America, Mexico, Nigeria, Israel and Lebanon, you can just see in that circle, India, Russia, South Korea, Indonesia, and last but not least, Britain there. Well, we started off by asking whether they have always believed in God. Nigeria, Indonesia, India and Lebanon, these countries, all strongly religious, polled above 90%. Then Mexico, America and Israel, all reasonably high. But then, watch this, there's a huge drop to the UK. 46% only said they have always believed in God. Russia and South Korea, even lower. Let's have a look at the UK results now in a little bit more detail. We broadened our statement to include not only a belief in God, but also belief here in a higher power. This is the UK figure. A third of respondents still said no, can't sign up to that. Still with the UK, what happens when we broaden the definition as far as possible? We ask, do you believe in God, higher power, or some sense of spirituality? More people were prepared to sign up to that, but still a full 16%, that's 1 in 6 people in the UK, said no. Back to the big picture now. And this was the next proposition. I find it hard to believe in God when there is so much suffering in the world. In the countries where there has been hardship, Lebanon, Nigeria, India, Indonesia, seems belief in God is unwavering. But the country that struggled most with suffering was the UK again. Look at that. More than half agreed that suffering did make belief very difficult. The next statement posed the question that has troubled man through the ages. Did God or a higher power create the universe? The replies were varied here. Indonesia, Lebanon, Nigeria agreed yes, it was God. India, America, Mexico and Israel all polled strongly here. But in the UK, barely half agreed. We are seeing a pattern here. Britain, South Korea and Russia, these 3 countries lagging behind in question after question. Finally, for the moment, we asked all 10,000 people if they would die for their God or their beliefs. Right at the top again, here they are, Nigeria and Indonesia. And there's a very high score from America as well, where nearly 3/4 said they would. Compare that to the UK, which at 19% is once again down at the bottom, along with South Korea. And what if we compare the different religions? Which of them are most likely to die in the name of their faith? Here are the results. Muslims, 85% said they would. That compares to 59% of Christians, just under half the Hindus, and here we are, a third of all Jews. James Jones, the UK seems to be struggling, doesn't it? What's going on?
In fact, Imran's just whispered to me, tough job you've got there. I think there are a lot of reasons, although I wouldn't want to let the church off the hook and say that there's a challenge here. What is interesting from these statistics is that whereas Britain was once a centre of mission, it now becomes a field of mission in the 21st century. So there are some tough challenges, but I think there are some reasons that explain those sort of statistics. Although again, a really interesting feature of the statistics is that when it comes to suffering, you'd have thought that a part of the world which suffered a lot would find suffering such a difficulty for belief in God. They don't, whereas we who have, by comparison, a very comfortable lifestyle, find suffering so intolerable and such an obstacle.
Andrew Motion, do you think we are seeing here the portrait of the UK as a secular nation?
Well, it seems like it, doesn't it? I think it's very difficult to feel convinced that the reasons for the lower end, the 3 lower end countries, the 3 least spiritual or devoted countries, having similar reasons for being in that state. I wonder in our own case whether it hasn't got, this may be a bit fanciful, but I wonder in our own case whether it hasn't got something to do with feeling, at least for the last several decades, that we've been a nation in decline from the days of empire. And during the days of empire, Christianity was so fundamental to what the empire was doing, what it was about, that maybe we've thrown that away as the empire has declined, and what we seem to have turned into now is a culture in which, and various other of your statistics bear this out, a culture in which the emphasis is very emphatically on the individual. So we've got a range of faiths, some of which are very small, others of which are more developed.
Imran Khan, you're a Muslim. I suppose you've lived here, I know, for a time. This might be something for Britain to be proud of, that people here have no onus on them at all to go a certain way. They can make up their own mind.
Well, just to give an example, Britain stood to gain from the war in Iraq, and yet people in my part of the world were stunned when we saw these massive demonstrations where people stood for fairness and justice, because they felt that it was an unjust war. That surprised all of us, because here is a country which is secular in the sense that most people don't believe in God, and yet there was the strong sense of fairness, which is rooted in religion. And it's an enigma to me and a lot of people from my part of the world.
Susan Greenfield, do you think that the sense of fairness is rooted in religion?
Not necessarily, it doesn't have to be. I think in this country, as Andrew says, there's a great premium on being an individual, and what intrigues me is how one manifests one's individuality, and it could even be through something like astrology. And I noticed the survey didn't say how many people in the UK believed in astrology. I think you'd have seen much higher figures if you'd seen that.
Yeah, there may be true. Were you impressed by the fact that as you widen the envelope, more and more people sign up? So when you say, do you have some sense of spirituality, people say, oh yes.
Well, exactly, and that's why I think if we'd widened it to astrology as well, then it would really have had a large buy-in. But I think it's very important that one has a sense of the individuality, and that's not a good thing necessarily.
Is individuality a bad thing for an institution, James Jones?
Well, I think it can be. I mean, I think we've got to set this in a context in this country where people are voting with their feet and not joining institutions in the way they once did. And certainly the church suffers from that cult of the individual and that sort of consumer society. I mean, that's not to let us off the hook. It's a big challenge. But I think these cultural contexts are things we've got to recognise.
And as someone once said, the danger is when you start to believe in nothing, you'll believe in anything.
Yes, for Chesterton.
Well, let me ask Jonathan Miller on that note. Jonathan Miller in New York. The very, very big picture of our poll, Jonathan Miller, is that there's a huge majority for God. How do you feel about that as an atheist?
Well, first of all, let me say I'm extremely reluctant to use the word atheist, not because I'm ashamed of it, but because I would never use a special term to describe my disbelief in witches or fairies, and the notion of atheism is something which has actually been thrust on those who actually have never entertained a thought for God. It's a badge, it's a label which I, as we now, have to lay claim to, simply because it would be shameful to deny it. So, yes, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. I don't even know what people are talking about when they use that glottally stopped monosyllable. It's never entered my thoughts. I was never introduced to it. Unfortunately, no one got to me before my cognitive immune system got working. So therefore, it never played a part in my life. And I think, in contrast to this program, where you have an unrepresentatively small number of people who are like myself, there are enormous numbers of people who simply have never given it a thought, even for whom disbelief itself is scarcely attended to.
But isn't it the case that the polls suggest that most people tend to believe in God, and therefore, I don't know if it's a massive collapse in the immune systems that you're referring to, but how do you explain that?
Well, first of all, I don't trust these sort of media-driven polls. They always ask extremely simple-minded questions and get simple-minded answers. It's never a way to really find out what the distribution of thoughts and opinions really is. Of course, religion is very widespread. It's been very long-standing. I think there are extremely complicated explanations to account for the existence of religion, and also for the developments and changes that have taken place in religion, and for the fading of it in certain places and the intensification of it in other places. It's an extremely complicated sociological and anthropological issue.
Let's talk about the results in Nigeria. Cardinal Arunze, your country is almost off the scale.
It's a very happy thing for me to note that your poll sees the Nigerians as believing there is God. They don't have any doubt. Suffering there is, but joy also there is. The Nigerians do not see only suffering. They also see joy. And they have no doubt about God, whether they be Christians or Muslims or followers of African traditional religion. They believe in God. They are sure.
Okay, let me turn, if I can, to Tunokwe, who's sitting next to you, who's South African. We mentioned she was brought up as a Methodist. Tunokwe, did you find yourself turning to God under apartheid in South Africa?
Well, as an African, we were taught that there is God, Umvelingangi. It's someone who appeared first, and that stayed with me. Even when I could see that the people who brought Christianity to our country were the oppressors, I still stayed there with the belief that God is there, and I still know, now I know that God is there.
Right, let's speak to Rabbi Shlomo Rizkin in Jerusalem if we can. Tell us what you make of this polling that we've done.
The real question is, how does one define God? And I think many of the responses would flow from that. From a Jewish perspective, from a biblical perspective, when Moses asked God, tell me, what is your glory? Who are you? What are you in this world, insofar as human beings can understand you? The response was that God is unconditional and free-giving love. Hashem Hashem kel rachum v'chanun. A God of justice, a God of peace, a God of truth.
Rabbi, thank you very much indeed.
If you have such a concept of God...
Just getting an early thought from you. We will come back to you on some of those subjects that you raised. Let's hear some more thoughts from across the world on why people believe.
I was born believing in God. It's almost woven into my psyche, into my DNA system, into my chromosomes.
Everything for me is evidence-based. I can't believe that's something that, that hasn't got any evidence to prove.
God doesn't speak very often, except in vampire films. He doesn't intervene, therefore I doubt he's there.
At once I was a crippled child on a wheelchair. But today I can jump and shout and sing and praise his name. That is why I believe in him so much, and that is why I always give glory to him.
I saw this dried packet seed, been in the store for maybe 10 years, and then something bloomed. And I thought, there's your proof, you know. How can anything from this dry thing, it's just so unbelievable.
I was once at an extremely low moment for various reasons in a very small airport, a very long way abroad. And I desperately needed somebody to talk to. And I bumped into somebody I know from my hometown. Now, it was probably just one of those things people put down to as coincidence. But those sorts of incidences have happened to me time and time again in my life. And there is a sensation that somewhere, somehow, you're being looked after.
If you believe in science, if you believe in evolution,